Velma Hastings never imagined her day in court would turn into a battle before she even set foot inside. Standing on the steps of the historic Fulton County Courthouse, she inhaled deeply, willing her nerves to settle. The grand building loomed over her, a silent witness to both the triumphs and injustices that had unfolded within its walls. Today, she was here to fight for her nephew, Jeremiah Hastings, a promising young man whose only crime had been raising his voice against oppression. Jeremiah, a 19-year-old freshman and aspiring writer, had joined a peaceful protest against police brutality when chaos erupted. Agitators infiltrated the march, smashing windows and igniting mayhem. The police, eager to make an example, had rounded up a group of young black men, Jeremiah among them. Despite clear video evidence proving his innocence, he was charged with destruction of property and resisting arrest. Velma had made a promise the night he was taken. She would not stop until his name was cleared. She adjusted the lapels of her navy blue suit, steeling herself for the battle ahead. The sun bore down on her, adding to the heat already simmering in her chest. Just as she prepared to enter, her phone buzzed. "Miss Hastings? It's Andrea. Just confirming tomorrow's meeting about the mentorship program." The ordinary nature of the call was almost laughable against the backdrop of her current struggle. "Yes, Andrea, tomorrow at noon. Thanks for checking in." She ended the call and turned her attention back to the courthouse doors, but just as she took a step forward, two uniformed officers stepped into her path. One was tall and wiry, his mustache twitching as he sized her up. The other was stocky, his stance wide and threatening. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification," the tall one said, his tone laced with authority, but dripping with something darker. Velma, accustomed to systemic microaggressions, handed over her driver's license without a word. The officer studied it far longer than necessary. "What business do you have here today?" he asked, his fingers tightening around her ID. "I'm here for my nephew's hearing," Velma responded evenly. She read his name tag, Officer Brad Tully. His partner, Officer Carl Dunn, smirked behind him, arms folded across his chest. "One of those protesters, right?" Dunn sneered. Velma kept her expression neutral. He was marching peacefully. He wasn't involved in any vandalism. Tully handed back her license, but his lips curled in a mocking smile. "Go on in," he said quietly. Yet even as he granted passage, his body language suggested otherwise. Dunn leaned in, his breath hot and sour against her cheek. "We'll be watching you," he murmured. "One wrong move, and you'll be in cuffs too." Velma's skin crawled, but she refused to let them see her fear. Instead, she met his gaze head-on. "I know my rights," she said firmly, stepping past them into the courthouse. The lobby was a stark contrast to the hostility outside, polished floors, soaring ceilings, and chandeliers that whispered of grandeur. But Velma had no time to admire the architecture. She made her way through security and hurried to the 4th floor, where she found Jeremiah sitting outside the courtroom, his lawyer, Linda Martinez, beside him. "Aunt Velma," Jeremiah said, standing to embrace her. Despite his relief, she could see the weight of the past few days etched into his face. "Miss Hastings, good to see you," Linda greeted. "Thank you for taking this on, Miss Martinez. I can't tell you how much this means to us." "We have a strong case," Linda assured her. "The footage clearly shows Jeremiah wasn't involved in the vandalism. With luck, the judge will recognize that." Inside the courtroom, the battle commenced. The prosecutor, Marcus Doyle, attempted to paint Jeremiah as a troublemaker, but Linda was relentless, presenting time-stamped footage and multiple witness statements. Velma watched as the judge, Marcia Hendrick, carefully reviewed the evidence. After nearly an hour of tense deliberation, Judge Hendrick spoke. "The evidence suggests Mr. Hastings was not involved in the destruction of property. I am ordering his release on his own recognizance." Velma's shoulders sagged with relief. Jeremiah squeezed her hand under the table, tears glistening in his eyes. It wasn't a full exoneration yet, but it was a step toward justice. As they left the courtroom, Linda cautioned, "The charges aren't fully dropped, but this is promising. Stay vigilant." Velma nodded, her mind already shifting to the next battle. They stepped into the elevator, Jeremiah's relief evident in his stance. But as they exited the courthouse, her earlier sense of dread returned. Officer Tully and Officer Dunn were waiting at the bottom of the steps, their smug expressions unchanged. Velma's grip tightened on her nephew's hand. She had fought too hard to let these men intimidate her now. Without hesitation, she reached into her handbag and dialed a number she never thought she'd need. "Agent Carter? This is Velma Hastings. I believe I have a case of police harassment outside Fulton County Courthouse." The moment the words left her mouth, the shift in the officers' expressions was instantaneous. Their arrogance wavered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Minutes later, the sound of sirens echoed through the air. 2 black SUVs pulled up and federal agents stepped out, their presence undeniable. For the first time that day, Velma saw something new in the officers' eyes: fear. Justice had arrived. Velma could still feel their presence, those officers lingering in her mind long after the courtroom doors had shut. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Their glares had been cold and threatening, and every nerve in her body screamed that they were just waiting for an opportunity to strike. As she and Jeremiah emerged from the courthouse, the heavy weight of suspicion settled over them. Sure enough, just as they reached the front steps, Velma's instincts proved right. Officers Tully and Dunn stood nearby, but they weren't alone. A third officer, tall and muscular, with a posture that radiated aggression, stood beside them. His arms were crossed in a way that made it clear he was ready for conflict. Jeremiah stiffened beside her. He had already heard the details of the situation before the hearing, and seeing the officers now only confirmed his growing dread. "Should we just keep walking?" he asked, his voice tight with anxiety. Velma placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, grounding him with her calm. "Yes, let's keep walking. We won't engage unless we absolutely have to." They moved forward, their steps deliberate, eyes fixed on the sidewalk ahead. But even as they tried to ignore the officers, the confrontation was inevitable. Just as they neared the sidewalk, Tully stepped in front of Velma, blocking her path. A sickly, feigned surprise crossed his face. Well, you're back," Tully said, tipping his hat back to reveal eyes as sharp and unforgiving as a blade. Dunn took a step forward, his sneer directed squarely at Jeremiah. "Is this the young thug who got picked up for that riot last week?" he asked, his words dripping with contempt. Velma's pulse quickened. She had to keep her composure for Jeremiah's sake. "He's not a thug," she said, her voice steady and calm. "He was cleared by the judge." "Cleared?" Dunn scoffed. "That's not how I see it." He gave Jeremiah a cold once-over. Once a troublemaker, always a troublemaker. The third officer, whose name tag read Henderson, spoke up in a low, menacing voice. "Why don't you two move along?" His tone was sharp, a clear warning. "Unless you're looking to cause more trouble around here." Jeremiah's lips parted in protest, but before he could say anything, Velma squeezed his arm. They had no reason to stay, and every reason to de-escalate. "Officer," Velma said, her voice calm but firm. "We're leaving." But as they attempted to pass, Tully moved to block their way once more, stepping so close to Velma that she could smell the bitter tang of coffee on his breath. "You think just because some liberal judge let him go, you're off the hook?" Tully's voice was laced with malice. "We'll be watching both of you." The tension between them was suffocating. Velma's mind raced, her every muscle tight with fury. She glanced around, noticing a few bystanders were now watching, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Don't you have somewhere else to be?" Velma asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "Or someone else to harass?" For a moment, Tully's face contorted with rage, and Velma braced herself for an outburst. Dunn's hand had already drifted toward the gun at his waist. "We don't take orders from you." Dunn snapped, his voice low and threatening. Jeremiah trembled beside her. Velma could feel the fear radiating from him. She had to end this now. Summoning all her courage, she locked eyes with Tully. "We're done talking." Without another word, she stepped around him, pulling Jeremiah with her, determined to walk away. But just as they were almost to the sidewalk, Tully's voice rang out behind them, loud enough for the small crowd of bystanders to hear. "You people never learn, do you?" Tully called after them. "Always thinking you're above the law." Something inside Velma snapped. Fury and hurt bubbled up in her chest, the pain of centuries of oppression, The weight of daily microaggressions, the memory of black men and women whose lives were destroyed by racial profiling and police brutality, it all surged inside her. She turned, her heart pounding, her voice shaking with rage. But then, before she could say anything, Jeremiah touched her arm gently, pulling her back. She could see the fear in his eyes, fear for her safety. She knew then that no matter how right she felt, any words she spoke could easily be twisted by the power-hungry officer standing before her. A racist cop could turn her righteous anger into a weapon that could hurt them both. Velma swallowed the words that burned on her tongue and turned away. She walked quickly, heart racing, her eyes threatening to spill over with tears of frustration. She had been silenced, but not defeated. In that moment, one thought rose above the others. This won't stand. By the time they reached Velma's car, Jeremiah was breathing hard, his gasps shallow and rapid as though he were on the edge of a panic attack. Velma guided him into the passenger seat and climbed into the driver's side, her own hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. A torrent of emotions crashed over her: rage, fear, exhaustion. She was furious at the raw, unapologetic racism they had just encountered. But she was also terrified for Jeremiah, so young and so vulnerable, his future constantly under threat. She was weary of fighting a system that felt like it would never change, but beneath the fear there was a flicker of determination, a flame that refused to go out. Velma had dedicated her life to helping young people navigate a system stacked against them. She knew people, good people, who could make a difference. She had connections, advocates, lawmakers, even contacts within the Department of Justice. Her mind wandered back to a distant cousin, Donovan, an FBI investigator who had once offered her a lifeline. Donovan had given her his card, saying, "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." Was this serious enough? Two racist cops harassing her, and Jeremiah might not seem like a big enough case for a full-scale FBI operation. But Velma knew these things didn't happen in isolation. Could this be part of a larger pattern of abuse in the precinct? Could Donovan help ensure that any complaint she filed would be taken seriously? Velma's hand trembled as she reached for her phone. Jeremiah looked at her, his brow furrowed. "What are you doing?" "I'm making a call," Velma replied, taking a deep breath. Her fingers flew over the screen, finding Donovan's number. She pressed dial and waited as the phone rang twice before his familiar voice greeted her. "Donovan Rod speaking." Velma exhaled, relieved to hear his voice. "Donovan, it's Velma Hastings, your cousin." A moment of recognition passed. "Velma, hey, it's been a while. How are you?" She could hear the warmth in his voice, but also the concern. "I'm okay, but something happened today. My nephew and I were harassed by some officers outside the courthouse. It wasn't just the usual hassle. It felt targeted, hateful." Donovan's tone shifted, serious now. "Tell me everything." And Velma did. She shared every detail, from the protest to Jeremiah's wrongful arrest, the hearing and the ugly confrontation outside. She left nothing out. The sneers, the racial slurs, the veiled threats. When she finished, Donovan was silent for a moment, then, "Velma, I'm so sorry you both had to go through that. I can't promise immediate action, but the FBI investigates civil rights violations when there's evidence of a pattern or practice. This might be bigger than just two bad officers. If they've done this before, I can talk to some colleagues in the Civil Rights Division and see what can be done." Velma closed her eyes, feeling a wave of relief. "Thank you. I'll get back to you soon with next steps," Donovan said. "In the meantime, keep your head down. I don't want them retaliating." Velma's throat tightened. "I will." She ended the call and turned to Jeremiah. His face was a mixture of grimness and uncertainty. "The FBI?" he asked softly. Velma nodded. "Just a conversation for now, but if there's a pattern they might investigate." Jeremiah stared out the windshield, fear and hope battling within him. "I never wanted any of this," he whispered. "I just wanted to stand up for what's right." Velma placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Sometimes, standing up for what's right leads us into battles we never expected, but you're not alone in this." As they drove away from the courthouse, the Atlanta skyline loomed in the distance, its towering buildings standing silent, bearing witness to the story that had only just begun. The following days passed in a blur. Velma kept to her routine, meeting with Andrea about the youth mentorship program, counseling troubled teens at the nonprofit, and helping Jeremiah catch up on his schoolwork. But the tension remained, like a dark cloud, always threatening to burst. She half expected to see Tully and Dunn around every corner, or to be pulled over without cause the next time she drove.
Velma nodded, her voice barely a whisper. Yes. Thank you for being here so quickly. Donovan's tight smile offered her some comfort. We've been watching. We were ready to step in if anything escalated. As Agent Doss continued to read Tully and Dunn their rights, making it abundantly clear that any attempt to intimidate witnesses would come with dire consequences, Velma couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The days of unchecked power and fear were quickly fading for these officers. A fleeting moment of pity for them crossed Velma's mind. Just a fleeting moment. But then her thoughts turned to the fear, the threats, the violence she had witnessed. Number. They deserved whatever was coming their way. After a tense few moments, Tully and Dunn were escorted toward a nearby police cruiser, their faces grim, their arrogance now replaced with genuine fear. It's just for questioning, Donovan murmured to Velma and Jeremiah. We're not arresting them yet, but we need to bring them in for a formal interview. Relief washed over Velma so intensely that her eyes began to well up with unshed tears. Jeremiah exhaled a nervous laugh, wrapping his arms around her. We did it, he whispered, a quiet strength in his voice. A local news crew, drawn by the commotion, approached Velma. They wanted a statement. At first, she hesitated, unsure of how to find the right words. But Jeremiah's encouraging nod gave her the courage to step forward. People need to know the truth, he urged softly. With renewed resolve, Velma approached the reporter, the microphone thrust toward her. Cameras rolled, capturing the moment as Velma spoke of Jeremiah's wrongful arrest, the harassment they had faced outside the courthouse, and the phone call to the FBI that had set everything into motion. She spoke passionately about the necessity of standing up against racism, even when fear loomed large. Her words, sharp and filled with raw emotion, resonated across the courthouse steps, reaching the ears of passers-by and viewers at home. In that moment, Velma realized that this battle was no longer just for her, or for Jeremiah. It was for every black man and woman who had ever suffered at the hands of a system that had promised protection, only to deliver oppression. When she finished, Donovan offered her a nod of approval. We'll take it from here, he said softly before turning toward the cruiser, where Agent Doss was briefing local officers. The news of the FBI's intervention spread like wildfire across the city. The reactions were mixed. Some celebrated, convinced that this was the dawn of a new era, while others remained skeptical, fearing that this was just another well-constructed cover-up. But the wheels of change had begun to turn. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution ran stories detailing the investigation, exposing whispers of an old guard within the police department, those who had protected officers like Tully and Dunn. The public outcry reached a fever pitch. Then came the turning point. One gray morning, Velma sat in front of the television, watching as live footage of Tully and Dunn being escorted into the federal courthouse flashed across the screen. Camera flashes erupted like a storm of light, capturing their every step. Both men kept their heads down, their usual arrogance replaced by tight, anxious frowns. They were dressed in suits, attempting to distance themselves from the badges that had once shielded them from accountability. Agent Doss stood before the cameras, his voice strong and deliberate. These allegations indicate a clear and consistent pattern of civil rights violations. We are working closely with the Department of Justice to ensure a thorough and fair investigation. Velma turned up the volume, her heart pounding in her chest. While part of her felt a surge of triumph, another part remained cautious, knowing how often justice had been denied in the past. Inside the courthouse, the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Missing body camera footage miraculously recovered from an unencrypted server, internal complaints buried and ignored, and sworn testimonies from victims who had suffered at the hands of Tully and Dunn. The truth, long buried, was now laid bare for all to see. At the preliminary hearing, Judge Harriet Delacqua, known for her unflinching integrity, presided over the case with unwavering authority. "Officer Tully, Officer Dunn," she said, her voice echoing through the courtroom. "The gravity and volume of these charges are extraordinary. Given the evidence before us, this court cannot in good conscience dismiss the allegations. You will stand trial." A collective sigh of relief rippled through the gallery. For Velma and Jeremiah, those words were more than just a victory. They were a promise of accountability. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed as bystanders jeered Tully and Dunn. The arrogant smirks were gone. The intimidation was gone. They were now just two men facing the consequences of